Welcome to Relevant Tones. I'm Seth Bosted, coming to you from my man cave in Washington Heights, Manhattan, which is not where I thought I would be doing the next episode of Relevant Tones, but times are what they are. I'm used to actually hearing applause when we do a live stream, but I'm remembering the applause that I heard at 7 tonight in New York. Every night at 7, everybody goes out and cheers. And I think because the weather is so nice, tonight was particularly joyful. So I've got that to remember, and I've got my red wine, nice little Pinot Noir. So I'm feeling good. We've got a great show for you. Tonight's show is called What's the Narrative? Great assemblage of guests. I think we're going to have a really marvelous conversation and some fantastic music. So happy that you've joined us. I will introduce our guests in a moment. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are streaming to 2 Facebook channels. So if you're watching it and you like what you're seeing and hearing, just hit the share button. We'd love if you do that. We won't be swearing or burping or any of that stuff. So feel free to do that. If you're watching us on YouTube, this is a new Relevant Tones. We never had a YouTube channel before. So we'd love for you to subscribe if you like what you're seeing there. Secondly, we are streaming to Zoom. If you've ever seen a Relevant Tones live stream before, it usually is a little more professional looking. But because we're bringing people in remotely, we had to use Zoom. So it's a little clunky. You're going to see my cursor. You're going to see, my desktop probably. You're going to see the man behind the curtain. It's me. So just bear with us, we hope, on that. And lastly, the music is all pre-recorded tonight because we really prioritized quality in the audio and the video. And because somehow I think we're all as busy in quarantine or busier than we were before. So we didn't want to drive ourselves nuts either. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our guests tonight. And as I do so, they can each turn on their camera and audio. Oh, I have to stop the screen share first. Let's remember all the little things that I have to do. Okay, great. So I'm going to introduce our guests. I'll start with the composers. So David T. Little is here with us today. Hey, David.
Hello, how you doing?
Great.
Good to see you.
Thanks for joining us from Weehawken, New Jersey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for putting all this together.
Yeah, and Natalie Joachim coming to us from Chicago, Illinois. All right.
Hiya.
Wearing her Nina Simone shirt. We have a literary guest. I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to say on Relevant Tones, and our literary guest tonight is J. Robert Lennon. John, thanks so much for coming to us from Ithaca, New York.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Seth.
Got that style and virtual background going. And our musical guests tonight are cellist Nick Fotinos and Yasuka Ora. So they're coming to us from Evanston, Illinois.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, guys. All right. So yeah, this is pretty cool. I mean, it's definitely a weird time, and I would much rather that we were on stage somewhere together. At the same time, getting all of you in a room would probably be impossible normally. So this is pretty exciting. So a little bit about the format of the show. Zoom conversations can be a little awkward. So I was telling all of our guests last night via email that I'm going to generally target a question to an individual. And if they don't feel like they have much to say, it's like Hollywood Squares. They can just point to somebody else and punt the question. But I think it's a little easier because otherwise you get that no you go thing in Zoom that can be a little awkward. So let's start with a question for John, our writer guest. Give you a little softball question, and we'll just kind of see where the conversation. Yeah, exactly. So the theme tonight is narrative in literature and music. So John, as a writer, I'm curious. When you have an idea for a story, do you have a sense if this narrative is going to work as a short story or a novel right away? I mean, do you know where it's going, or does it sometimes even surprise you as you're developing it?
The older I get, the more surprised I am by the results, I have to say. Sometimes I have an idea and I know that it's a short story idea because usually it's it sort of encapsulates a small experience in someone's life, a series of events that, I don't know, feels to me like would best be done quickly. And in terms of who is going to be sort of consuming it, read in one single session, right? Start to finish. Sometimes I think I'm writing a story and I get 10 or 15 pages in and suddenly realize that whatever this thing is that I've started, it can't be finished in a reasonable amount of time. There's a piece that just came out this week in Granta called The Station, that involves a guy arriving on a seemingly abandoned island with some buildings on it where he has to do some kind of job. And I thought it would be a sort of Kafkaesque a short piece, and by the time I got to the end of it, it was pretty clear that I'd asked more questions than I'd answered, and I would have to keep going. So I will eventually, but I haven't yet.
That's actually something that's really interesting in music too. I was thinking that there's so many times I've been at a concert and I'm listening to a piece and I'm thinking, I don't know if I like this piece. And then something happens at the end and it changes my understanding of the entire piece. I'm like, oh shoot, now I want to hear it again. David, is something like that ever happened to you musically?
Well, I definitely have had the experience of when I'm writing something, sort of not necessarily knowing where it's going, or even fully understanding the work until sometimes years after it's premiered. That happened with Soldier Songs, where I knew that the ending needed to be what it was, but it wasn't clear to me why, and it wasn't really clear to me what it meant until I was in dress rehearsal, I think several years after the premiere, and then said, "Oh, I get it now. This is what it is, and this is why it needed to be this."
Hmm. And Natalie, how about you? Have you had that sense like that the what happens at the very end of a piece could potentially change your understanding or the way that you experienced what came before?
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely had that experience, and I think that I'm trying to get more into a space of like, definitely, I would say the past several years, I've been sort of switching it up and letting go of the idea of like the order of a thing, and also just sitting with the material for a long time, a really long time, so that it sort of lets me know how it wants to be shaped instead of, I think I used to be really attached to this sort of like linear, like this is how this is going to end, or like, this is what I'm working towards. um and so I'm just gotten to this weird place of being like, the beginning of something is just where you start, where you're starting to make something. It doesn't mean that that's the beginning of the thing or the end of the thing even. And so I've been turning a lot of work on its head lately, which feels kind of nice.
Well, that's an interesting thing too, because there's been a lot of times that I've started writing something thinking it's the beginning of the piece, and it becomes the middle, or it becomes the end. John, does that happen to you in narrative with storytelling? Do you ever say like an event that you think is going to start a novel, actually, it turns out that it is going to work better later on in the novel?
Yeah, in fact, what Natalie was saying really spoke to how I've changed over time too. When I was younger, I would get an idea and I would fully flesh it out in my head, and I could picture the sort of perfectly formed version of it. And I'm sure that the composers have had similar experiences. You begin to actually create the thing, and you get something different. And I think when I was younger, I thought of that as a bug, and now I think of it as a feature, right? The initial idea, the thing that I think is going to be the nexus, the important germ of the story, might end up being entirely extraneous and might not even make it into the final thing. So the process has gradually become much more important to me than some conception that I think of as perfect when I think of it.
I know I said I'm not going to throw this out to everybody, but I'm throwing this out to everybody. Do you? Because that happens to me too. Something I thought would work in a piece. It's good material, but it's not going to make it. It's not going to work in this particular piece. I pull it aside and keep it somewhere else. Everybody, can we react to that? Like, how do you feel about that? All
I'm
right, I'll call on
very
somebody.
into pulling
Natalie.
things. I'm very into pulling things aside and putting them in a box to look at later. And this moment in time has been good. I've been finding all kinds of things in those boxes lately, which is great. Because it is true that it's not always that they're bad. They just didn't become a part of the thing. It's just like this wasn't its home. So I kind of like that. And also, when you come back to things, like there's a piece that I was looking at recently that like or a little sketch of something from years ago. And now my brain is just, my whole like life experience is so different in this moment that it allows me to take it somewhere very different now than I once would have. So I love that actually.
Mm-hmm. David, how about you?
I don't tend to do that when I'm writing music, but I will definitely do that with ideas, and narrative ideas. And actually, and This Guy Was Still There is an example of that, and we can get into that later. But that was definitely something that was, the story was sort of left over from another project, and it didn't quite fit into that initial project, and then it found its own home.
Mm-hmm. And John,
But
you went ahead.
musically I tend to be, when I'm writing the piece, I will, if I don't use something, I'll usually just kind of throw it away, and then I don't save a lot in terms of material.
I have a folder in my documents called Orphans. That's all the stuff that I've abandoned and will never go back to. But occasionally, I do have the last novel of mine that I published involved this subplot involving a couple of criminals. One of them kind of a psychopath, and the other one sort of along for the ride. And they came from a failed novel that I'd spent a year and a half writing, and then sent it to my agent and was told, "Nah, you should write another one." and I set it aside. But then these two characters, I thought of them as the only good thing in the book. And when I needed someone to fill a role in the new book, I realized, oh, of course, those guys. And of course, once I brought them in, they changed according to the story that I was telling in that book. But I was glad to get to rescue them from another work.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too. The idea of your agent or editor having so much feedback over what writers do, and we kind of have that as composers with publishers, but not really as much. I'm not sure that the relationship is as in depth, but we'll come back to that. Curious to talk to Nick and Yasuko a little bit from your perspective right now. I mean, you do a lot more than this, but as performers, when you're playing music, what we've been talking about, how is that resonating with you? What thoughts are filtering through your mind right now?
Well, it depends. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking about, the difference between improv, which I haven't done that much of, and then like most of the performance I'm doing, which is really, you have the whole thing laid out, and it's imperative that you know where it's going when you start. And that knowing that ending can often help you like decide how to approach the beginning. So like, as performers will often, it's really great to not just rehearse things beginning to end, but start in the middle, start at the end, not only because you can get bogged down at the beginnings, but also so you can get like a really fully formed sense of the whole thing without, by just looking at that by itself first. So.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting thing with improvisation too, versus structured music, where in improv I've caught myself listening and I think, oh, that's a perfect ending, and then they continue to play, and I think, darn it, you missed a perfect ending. But that's not the point of improvisation, I'm thinking all narratively and structurally, and sometimes I have to remind myself, like that's not what this is, Seth. Like, chill out.
But I will say, when you're improvising, part of that is like finding the ending, right? I mean, there is that sort of element to it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you do hear a lot of missed endings in composed music too.
And in Pulp Fiction, I must say as well. I mean, I wanted to say, Seth, don't chill out. Don't chill out.
I was going to say about performing music too. I think it's people were talking about like in a story, having to write X amount of time, but finding out it's really a novel. I find the reverse is often true, where like I hear a piece and like, oh man, this would be such a killer 10-minute piece. Unfortunately, it's 20 minutes long. It's like, maybe someone did need an editor. And it's funny because like in music, we, composers often don't get one. So.
True.
Well, yeah, and editors deal more with parts and, the sort of materials, then you should cut these 30 bars.
Right.
Yeah. I have to say that's like one of my favorite things about like having a creative partnership with Allison and Flutronics is because we co-write a lot of music together, but I have someone who like knows me very well, who can be like, girl, this whole section is just a wreck. Like delete. It's kind of nice. It's actually nice to have a built-in buddy for that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that sometimes I bet this is true for you as well, that you feel so attached to a thing that you're eventually going to get rid of. But the reason you feel so attached is that's the thing you work the hardest on. And the reason you work the hardest on is because it's bad. You're trying to make it good and you can't.
It's so true. I have to say though, I will say about this whole like thinking of narrative and order and like how we intake music and like where to even begin listening or performing it. I feel a way about like shuffle and listening to albums. I miss the time in which like we really were forced to listen to albums beginning to end, and there was like no just like, oh, I'm skipping through this. Like the experience of the album was the thing. And I think back to like the early 2000s, late 90s, when that was like my whole life was like I knew every breath on every album possible. You just know the whole thing beginning to end. And then, the invention of shuffle came and you're like, is anybody listening to this whole thing? Like, why am I, it makes you think about listening to recorded music definitely in a different way.
I'm curious if all the composers, including Seth, could talk about that. Like, how has some of you, I guess some of you are younger than me, but not all of you maybe, but like this change in the way people listen to music, has it changed the way you think about your composition and performance of music?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I don't think it probably should have changed how I think of it more than it has. Uh, that's my safe answer.
Yeah, I think my works have just gotten longer and longer as, they were all shorter before shuffle existed, and now they're like, 30 minutes to 2 hours. So
I always just assumed that nobody's listening to my stuff on Spotify because I'm a contemporary classical music person, and I just figure, it's I don't think it's affected me so much. I mean, and so much of my life has revolved around concerts, around doing things live. I mean, that's why really this time is difficult right now, because I like recorded music, but I have issued very little of my music on recordings. I've spent very little time in recording studios. I have instead put so much energy into producing and participating in and playing on and going to concerts. So I can't say shuffle has affected me too much, except that maybe I'm thinking like I'm a loser and I was focusing on the wrong things, Now recorded sound, like, yeah, that was probably the way to go. Let's segue to Natalie's piece. Let's have a nice music break. So Natalie, we were talking about yesterday via email about your piece, and I was saying that there isn't a narrative per se, and yet you've done this marvelous idea of evoking an entire world. Talk about the piece a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really like that that is how you described it, because in many ways this piece was really the predecessor, or it's like the first nugget of me beginning to think of the concept behind my album Fum T. And what's funny about that is that whole album is like deeply narrative and deeply rooted in narrative, and like has such a narrative thread, connective tissue through the entire record. So it is nice to go back to this piece because it reminds me of the moment like before I knew that there was going to be a through line. And I was really just thinking about the people, my own family, how we share time with one another through music, the landscape of Haiti, and how music is really ever present. And that was really what this piece became about, sort of painting the picture of that landscape, my connection to these voices, and a sort of interesting way of like centering them and weaving them in with an acoustic instrument. So that's the story behind it. The piece is called Dame Moigno, which means my ladies, and it features samples of my own voice, the voices of my cousins, all kind of woven together, which is really, it's a family affair, which feels really nice. And it's about just that. It's sort of about celebrating these female voices that have been such a deep part of the soundtrack of my life. And right now is a moment where I would love to be able to be on our farm in Haiti and hearing all these sounds. So I like that we're listening to this tonight, and Nick plays it gorgeously every time, flawlessly. So I'm always happy to listen to him perform it.
Awesome. Nick, any thoughts on the piece?
She summed it up. It's a beautiful piece to play. Thank you so much, Natalie. So
thanks for playing it.
I adore playing.
All right, let's turn off our cameras and mics, and we'll listen to Natalie's piece, Dame Moigno. Okay, that was Dam Wen Yo by Natalie Duachen. Big applause.
Good job, Nick.
Performed by Nick Potinos on cello from the comfort of his living room. Pretty cool. Yeah, that's such a beautiful piece, and I was thinking it is, there's this concept of saying a lot with very, very little. And Natalie, I think you've done that there in many respects, and I mean that like in a really good way, like a haiku, like these brushstrokes. And again, it's like we'll talk about a little bit going towards my piece, because there's a concept in painting of leaving some space empty, so that you focus more fully on the space that the painter wants you to see. But in your piece, I get the feeling that, I mean, it just transports me like immediately. And I do think one of the things I wanted to talk about is this idea of abstract music, or I'm sorry, absolute music versus program music, because some people have said that an F chord is FAC. Those are the pitches, they're frequencies. There's no inherent meaning in them. And that's probably true, except for the fact that if you play an F chord for a human being, we're going to go, oh, it's happy. Who's happy? Why are they happy? And we had this causality where we want to walk it back. And I think that it's a function of humans to graft narrative onto things. So when I hear your piece, I'm just saying, like, for me, I'm so curious about these women. I'm curious about their lives. And you can't help but kind of invent stories for people as you listen.
I love that. That's, it's also like very true to the Haitian spirit. I think that Haiti is culturally, we're all about storytelling. I mean, Nick will tell you, if you ask me to tell you any story, there's like what happened, and then there's the like Haitian version of what happened, which is like always super colorful. And so there's a lot of storytelling, practice and how we participate with each and engage with each other as a culture. So I really love that comes out in this piece. And yeah, I love that it could help create a picture for you in your own mind that is personal to you, or makes you feel the music more deeply, because I don't know, that's gratifying to me. I know it's not, I know, as you said, like for a lot of composers it sort of doesn't matter, but for me, I am interested in this space where the personal for me, can transport someone to their own personal space, and how those, how those worlds interact even conceptually is really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. And what you said reminds me, there's this old movie called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and a publisher says, if you have the chance to publish the truth or the legend, publish the legend, because that's, I mean, we are myth-making people, creatures, like that is really what we are. We can't help it. And I think that's a big part of narrative. I mean, I don't know, we don't have time to get into truth versus, whatever, but great. Okay, any other thoughts on that? Cool. So I want to talk about this idea in painting of having negative space that influences how, the idea is that the painter wants you to look at a painting and see this thing first, and then this, and then this, which is a form of narrative, really, how you're reading the painting, as it were, and leaving certain areas blank is one way that they do that. I'm curious, John, is there an equivalent in literature? Is there an equivalent in writing where you leave things unsaid to hopefully say things more strongly, or guide people in a certain direction?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's maybe the hardest thing to learn. My day job is teaching writing at a college, and I'm often telling my students that you don't need all this extra stuff, that you can just strip it down to these things and then build those back up, ignoring all the stuff on the outside. That I feel like we want art to be a little enigmatic. We want the experience of trying to figure it out, and so I think a skillful artist hints at possible meanings, or may even offer up a ready-made meaning and then sort of slyly undercut it, so that the reader or the viewer or the listener can sort of form their own idea of what's actually going on. I think there's also a sense that literature is maybe more programmatic than any other form, because the words are right there and they say what happens. But of course, I always tell my students, when we're all reading the same book, I go out of my way to point out that everyone has got the same text in front of them, but we've all, fiction is a participatory art, right? We're recreating this world in our heads based on the map that the writer has given us, and everyone has a different view of it, and often we have very different opinions about what we just read. So
David, you teach composition. I mean, do you feel like you're saying the same thing to students? I used to teach composition too, and I remember thinking people don't have trouble coming up with ideas. They have trouble ordering them in a way that makes sense. Or do you find that students are putting way too many ideas, too much material into their pieces?
It depends. I mean, I think every student is different, and so I can't make any sort of general statements about it. But I definitely think, what you're saying about the sort of literal meaning versus, that the book is a map, right? Makes me think of the difference between someone like Strauss and Webern, right? I feel like there is a kind of journey in each of these composers' works, but someone like Strauss, these tone poems where it's something very specific. It's like, now you're on a mountain, now there's a storm. I find that, and I love Strauss, but I find that a little irritating. Whereas listening to some like Webern, the symphony, there's definitely a journey, and you're sort of experiencing all of these different possibilities of story that you're sort of creating yourself. But there isn't, there's no specific mountaintop that you're climbing to greet the sun or whatever,
You just segued to the next thing I want to talk about. Thank
you.
Oh,
did I?
It was awesome. So like, again, this concept that I had for white space, I mean, when someone says, well, how did you put that into music? Which I've been guilty of asking people that question in interviews before, and they go, I don't know. It was my inspiration. And I sat down at the piano and this is what came out, which is very much the truth for me too. But I'm thinking, I'm thinking of a case years ago, to your point, David, where I wrote a piano concerto, and the second movement was inspired by this idea, yukimi sake in Japanese. And I'm probably abusing that word horribly, but the idea was a philosophical idea to drink sake while the snow falls, and you ponder the fleeting nature of time, temporality, in a sort of beautiful way, like you're at peace with it. And I thought, yep, that's the second movement. I'm going to write my second movement. And I got reviewed, which is awesome. But the critic dinged me. She said something like, well, I don't get how at 4 minutes this is still related to that. And I'm like, no, that was just my initial inspiration. And then I worked it out musically from there. I mean, I'm not going to, this isn't where he puts the cup down, and this is, so I'm just curious if people can react to that. Like in your own music, have you had experiences with that, the kind of expectations that people have when you give program notes or when you say what your inspiration is?
I mean, I had something as a listener kind of maybe like that when I was, maybe 15, listening to John Zorn's Naked City albums and experiencing that from a 15-second song, I had a memory of an hour of music. And the idea that that how time works in music and how time interacts with the memory is its own sort of world to be explored. So I love the idea that you have this piece that is sort of about the long reach of time that is 4 minutes long. I think that's kind of perfect. That's sort of the perfect length for a piece about eternity, in a way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I really like this idea that we're talking about where you give a listener a general suggestion of something, knowing full well that they will graft their own things onto it, that it won't, it will always be different. And it is interesting when you have I'm sure every composer here, and John too, if you've done a reading, I mean, you've done readings, lots of readings, but people come up to you afterwards and they always say like, oh, your piece reminded me of, and they tell you the story, and it's completely unrelated to what you were thinking. It's like, wow, cool. I mean, they're going to do that no matter what you do, which is, and we're all going to die someday, and hopefully our music will still get played. And, it's an intriguing thing, really, that I think it's better to almost just make a suggestion and know that it's going to be interpreted in various and sundry ways.
I feel like if you're the kind of artist who really wants people to get a specific thing out of your work, you're going to be very disappointed talking to people who actually enjoy it. Because I think that you're right, that happens a lot. People's responses to the work are really varied.
Mm-hmm. And that's great. I mean, I feel like that's sort of what it's about. It's about people taking what they need from the work, and I think we can give them as much as we can put into a work that they can draw from and then, find inspiration from. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah. I was going to say, actually, I have never, this brings like film scoring to my mind so vividly. And I have never done any film scoring myself, but I recently had a piece of mine be used in a film, and it was like kind of amazing to see that it worked, and also that the story has like nothing at all to do with like where the piece came from, what it was about, like my inspiration behind it, just not connected in any way. But I bought it, you know what I mean? Like if I were just seeing the film and had never known my music, I would have totally believed that it was like created for that moment, and I think that's beautiful.
Cool.
Like
All right,
music for 18 in Hunger Games. It works so perfectly. Steve was totally thinking that when he wrote it, I'm sure.
All right, let's take a music break. So we're going to hear Nick and Yasuko perform my piece, White Space. This is a short piece. It's part of a larger piece. This is one movement. I think it's about 4.5 minutes. All right, we'll turn off our cameras and have a listen. All right. Thank you. And thanks to
Beautiful.
Nick and Yasuko, too. I love my ninths, and Nick is killing them.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, that was lovely.
Those are not, I know, your hand. That's like brutal.
All in day's work.
So we're moving towards Andrew Norman's sonnets, and I wanted to chat about this. Kind of mentioned it a little bit, but one of the interesting things about a sonnet or a haiku that I think is really fascinating in narrative is this kind of like there's like a switcheroo at the end, you know. So they'll say a couple of things, and you think that you're in one setting, and then the final line or the final stanza in a sonnet will change your understanding of it again. It's like we were talking about temporally with music. I'm curious about that, John. Is that a device that you've used, not like specifically writing a sonnet, but is that a device you've used in a short story or something where a character is actually a mass murderer, or there's a completely different understanding of this character because of a twist somewhere?
Yeah, I'm of two minds about this. I mean, what you're sort of the way you're putting it is the sort of twist ending of a story or a action thriller movie or something, which can be really entertaining, but is also kind of a tick. As a teacher, I see a lot of attempted twist endings that don't really work that much or work that well, rather. But I do think that art has to undermine expectations in some way, otherwise it becomes predictable, right? The thing I often say in class is that you don't want to give the reader what they want. You want to give them the thing that they don't yet realize that they want. You have secretly been setting the stage for something so that when it happens, it won't seem like it's out of left field. It will seem real and realistic and true, but it will also surprise the reader. Rather than the other side of that coin is that such an ending can be kind of manipulative, right? You feel like you've been tricked, and thus it feels like a gimmick. But I actually think that, a well-rendered surprise in fiction matches what happens in life, the kind of situation where you're shocked when something happens. And then when it's all over and you look back on it, you think, oh, of course that was going to happen. Of course it was.
It's so fun. I'm just thinking, so we've gone a long ways from the concept of the sonnet into the plot twist. So we're going to go there, which is cool, because I don't want the chat to blow up like, that's not what a sonnet is.
Can I say one more thing? I was mentally pushing back on your F chord like half an hour ago, because if if someone plays the F and then they play the A and they wait 10 seconds to play the C, you get the chord, but there's this moment where you feel like, am I going to get the chord? Or am I not going to get the chord? And in those 10 seconds, like whole worlds of anxiety can happen for the listener, right? Or at least for the reader in my literary equivalent of it.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, because you bring up expectation, knowing that something's about to happen, but not knowing when it is a form of torture. But with the F major chord, you could also play the A and C in a range where it sounds like it's minor, and then play the F so low or high. I mean, it doesn't have to be a happy sound, is what I'm saying. So there's a variety of ways to play with expectation sonically, but also temporally, which is pretty interesting. So Nick, Andrew wrote the sonnets for you, is that right?
No.
Oh, sorry.
But that's okay.
Hey,
I did. I was the first to record it.
Great.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, and I mean, like, they're just really beautiful miniatures. I mean, like, he even explains in the program notes that he is kind of referencing, like, the titles are all taken from, little bits of the sonnets, but they're just like 3 words. They don't really have that much to do with the sonnet as a whole. It's really just these interesting little, like, word snippets. And then he runs with it for 1.5 minutes. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's more about, I mean, you can say it better than me, Nick, but it's the sound, right? It's not necessarily the way that a sonnet is structured.
Yeah, well, so yeah, again, in the notes, he says he was interested in the Italian word sonetto, which is little song. So yeah, so each of these is just a little song that's riffing on this, like, one little idea. And it's interesting because there's so much narrative you can, like, we were just talking about the narrative that you can get out of 3 notes. I think this is that exactly, except riffing off of just a small little literary snippet.
Do you want to list them?
They're listed on the
the
recording, yeah.
Okay.
So you'll see the names of each one.
Nick doesn't remember, do you? No, I'm kidding.
No, I do remember. I'm sure if I listed them off, I would forget one of them. So that's why I put them on the video.
Hey, that's why we use slides, Okay, let's do it. Let's listen to. So yeah, we've got 3 pieces to go. Plenty of time to talk and everything. But let's keep moving. So we'll take a music break. Listen to the Sonnets by Andrew Norman, played by Nick Fotinos. Hey, Nick, come on back for a second here. Did I let it go
Okay.
too far?
Huh?
Did I let it go too far?
Did you let it go? No, it was
Video?
in the middle of the third movement.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry. Freaking out, man. I had a little problem with my computer. We're going back to it. Let's go back to it. I'm very sorry about that, guys. Just a little problem on this end, but we're good. That's a
Nice
great
editing,
performance.
Yasko. That was cool.
Yeah, it was great.
Absolutely great. Yeah.
Yeah,
Negative
Yasuko,
space.
we haven't talked to you very much tonight. So, what tell us about your thoughts, the Andrew Norman piece, or any thoughts that you've been thinking about while we've been chatting this evening?
Well, it's funny because when I play Andrew Norman's piece, I actually don't think about the narrative so much, but I feel like each movement has a specific gesture that he's going for, and he just runs with that. And it's nice and concise, and like to be tickled. I mean, it sounds like you're being tickled, and it just, I don't know, puts a smile on my face every time. And I don't know. So it kind of goes against the theme of what we're talking about, the narrative. But I mean, I guess I think of most of these music as gestural, and it has a lot of color, and that's what I enjoy exploring when I play these pieces.
But don't you think that's kind of like tools to build narrative?
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of it. It's a way of communication.
Yeah.
That's why we love Nick. He's like, but it still relates.
But it's
It's so Nick. It's so Nick.
You can say that. You can do it.
No, it's great. I think of the pieces, or the slower ones, as being very atmospheric as well. I mean, where you're not, it's not not necessarily a narrative per se, but this sense of a space or a place or a mindset
And character.
Mhm.
I think he really builds like really distinct characters. I mean, especially some of them I like. It's actually weird for me to watch the tongue-tied muse, because like I start getting tense just watching me like it's like really watching someone stutter, and it's like I don't know, it's so visceral, like you could almost imagine this person as a literary character or something.
I really liked the one with all the the ricochets and the glisses. I was like, that's nice. Sounds very nice.
Yeah.
David, I'm glad to see your cat. I originally was muting myself because my cat was just like meowing really loud.
Oh no. Yeah, she just
she's cool now.
She might be contributing to the conversation.
And she's welcome.
Yeah.
Absolutely welcome. So let's move forward towards Karen Tanaka's Song of Songs. This is a pretty interesting piece in many respects, and the story behind it. So, I mean, just in case people don't know what the Song of Songs is, Yasuko or Nick, or both of you, why don't you just tell us what the inspiration is for this piece?
You want to go? You want me to go?
I mean, originally we programmed it for our chamber music series in Chicago called Chamber Music at Bethany. Little plug there. And we did that entire program around the Song of Songs, about Song of Solomon. And so every single piece of music we programmed on that night has something to do with Solomon.
Yeah, and for people that might not know about the piece, or about the Song of Solomon, so it's this kind of epic poem that's at the end of the Bible, and it's in a completely different form than the rest of it. It's basically erotic love poetry at the end of the Bible, and it starts with the kisses of the mouth, and like it's really like. It's like, what is this?
To lead with this in Bible school, by the way, because I might have stuck around if I knew that was going to come at the end.
Right.
It's like,
that's after they confirm you that they.
That's going back to your point of being like, sometimes you got to start at the end so that you really know if you want to stay around.
But the idea of the twist,
like dark skin touching me. I mean,
your breasts are like two gazelles.
Yeah,
I mean, like
gazelles.
Like gazelles, why not?
Very active breasts.
So, maybe it is the consolation prize to getting to the end of the Bible. I don't know. But it's basically like this poem of love, and so getting back. So people have made a lot about it. What is this doing here? But also the way that theologians have like gotten around that over the centuries. Have been like, oh, well, they're talking about platonic love. They're talking about love for God. It's like, But if you go that direction, I mean, it really is like a very visceral description of love. And I think this is what Karen Tanaka does in this piece. It's a really evocative piece. It's a slow unfolding of these really just beautiful gestures, relatively gentle for the most part. It's just a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily have to know anything about the Song of Songs to have this piece work, which I think is always the great hallmark of any piece. I mean, it's along with David's piece, like you don't need to know about that story for it to, you know, I mean, well, you'll hear the story. We can talk about that a little later, but still, I mean, like even without that story, like it tells you something with just the music. It's
Yeah, that's great. I think too. I mean, it's the only part of the Hebrew Bible that isn't Talmudic law. That isn't. I mean, it's this completely separate thing. And I think too. I mean, there's this idea that Solomon was a necessary evil. I mean, he was the king. He was very flawed in many ways. But I mean, if they were to survive, if they were to have their religion, I mean, there's a thing of that in religion where you have the very material type of person, but unfortunately that person is necessary. And I wonder if the Song of Solomon were included just to appease Solomon in a way, or just like there's a lot of politics in things. I mean, even going back to that time.
Yeah.
Not that any of us knows about I mean, those of us who work at universities know all about politics, but we won't go there. Cool. Let's have a listen to Song of Songs. I think everything's okay. My computer did a little thing and the fan started, but everything seems to be perfect now. So we're going to listen to Song of Songs, and we'll come back and continue our conversation.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. I mean, for for a sexy love tale at the end of the Bible there.
Well, that's
Sexy
funny
Bible
because
tale.
I know, like I started out ribald, but really she's channeling the like deep sense of love.
Yeah,
Is really
yeah.
what that piece is about.
That's great. Beautiful, beautiful.
What instruments are playing the backing track?
That is a great question for Karen Tanaka. And like, I've actually been emailing her over the past couple of days, and she might even be listening. I hope so. Hi, Karen, if you are. I mean, I think it's electronic samples largely with a couple of what sounds to me like some Crotale hits.
Yeah.
Sprinkled in, and then like maybe some gongs and some other things.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took me to a whole another headspace. I'm a different human now than I was.
We all are.
Probably a good thing. Oh yeah, yeah.
And actually, that reminds me of another question I failed to ask earlier, which is what is the percussion on Natalie's piece that you played at the beginning of the show?
You know, actually, it's just like a really heavily processed vocal sample. All of the sounds that you hear are voices in one way or another. So,
Oh, that's super cool. All right, well, we're moving towards David's piece, the last piece that we have on the program tonight. And David's piece is interesting because it actually is a story. There is a narrative there. So, David, why don't we start just by tell us, who's speaking and what the story is.
Yeah, so and this guy was still there. It tells the story of Amber Ferenz, who was an Arabic linguist in the army, and while at sergeant school, came out to her superior officer and was thrown out. This is during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell period. And she originally told me this story as part of a number of stories that she contributed to my opera Soldier Songs. And Soldier Songs falls into sort of three areas of soldiers' experience, looking at basic training, looking at combat, and looking at life after the military. And this really just stood out as its own completely unique story among the stories that I had been told by those I interviewed. And so going back actually to something we said earlier about the idea of taking something and putting it aside, this was something where I said, I don't want to try to force this into Soldier Songs. It's its own special and beautiful thing. I think it has a very spiritual quality to it. And so I sort of put it aside and said, someday I'm going to do something with this. That opportunity came in 2009, 2010, when Todd Reynolds, violinist, asked me to write a piece for him. And after a lot of discussion, I played this interview for him, and I said, I think this would be a really interesting piece. And he agreed, and we sort of got to work on it. And then fast forward, Nick, I don't remember exactly what year it was that I think you and Todd had sort of worked up this new version of it, or you had worked it up, and Todd was helping with Ableton, as Todd is amazing.
Yeah. Well, so he and I both teach at Bang on a Can Summer Music Festival, and he had come out with that on his album, and I'd heard it, and he played it live. And one of the first thoughts I had was, wow, this would work so well on cello. And at first I was like, oh, I don't want to steal it from Todd, but Todd was like overjoyed. It's like, oh no, here, please, like, yeah, go for it. And so, we talked about it, and I showed him what I had done. He's like, here's what you should change a little bit of. And so yeah, it was great. And it does work really well for cello, it turns out.
That's such a Nick. Nick is like out to like get rid of all the other string instruments, just so you know. I'm gonna let everybody in this circle know that. Look out, if you're a violist, watch your back. He's coming for that rep. He is coming for it.
That's just stealing it back, really.
Right.
So David, back to the composer. Nick is like stealing from the composer too. Staging the composer too. No, I'm kidding. So David, with the you have this narrative, this story. How much in the music that you put around this were you responding to the sounds of her voice and adding sounds that you knew would go along with that? Well, how much were you responding to the story that she's telling? How much underscoring? How much part of it?
Yeah. So the process for this piece was really interesting. It was the sort of deal I made with Todd was that I would write this piece for him and he would teach me how to use Ableton, right? So that was the sort of like the arrangement. And so this is the first music I ever made in Ableton. And I really focused on the sort of backing track. I focused on the sort of musical elements and also the placement of where and how Amber's story would be told. And then I gave that to Todd and I said, let's try something. I want to make this as idiomatic as possible. I want to make it feel as organic as possible for the player. So why don't you improvise? Todd's a great improviser. And I said, why don't you just record 5 takes of you improvising to this track that I had made and see what you come up with. And then I'll take those sessions and I will chop them up and I will rearrange them and I will like sort of build a violin part, the solo part out of that. And what ended up happening is that certain things that he improvised ended up staying on the track. So there are these moments where there are these sort of duets that kind of emerge. And those were things that he maybe did similar gestures at the same time in each improvisation take or at different times in the take. And I sort of connected them. And it sort of was built pretty collaboratively in that way. It's interesting. It's one of the only, this piece and then this piece, Hold My Tongue, that just came out on this Beck Plexus record are the only 2 pieces that were really built this collaboratively in this sort of studio kind of way. But hopefully it results in something that feels really good to play.
Well, yeah, but I think also, I mean, I've heard the piece several times, and it's interesting because I think the music adds a lot. I mean, as it should. Obviously, it's a piece, but there's a sense of not dread per se, but there's this sense of just like you're really on edge as you listen to it, but you can hear her story perfectly. So I think there's a really good balance between those 2 elements. And just curious, how hard you worked to achieve that balance.
Well, I mean, in terms of mix or in terms of actual sort of compositional stuff?
In mix and in terms of, I mean, making sure her narrative is always at the fore, but that your music is, sort of, speaking of scoring films, like Natalie mentioned, I mean, sort of manipulating our emotions while we're hearing this narrative.
Right. It was a lot of sort of tweaking and trial and error and sort of, working on it over and over again and trying to find the right balance. That was a tricky thing. And also, how do you write a piece for a solo instrument where you have to make sure you hear the story that's being told, that you have to, that it is already a duet with the violinist and Amber, right? So that from the beginning was already a sort of balance that I had to sort of strike. So it was, it was a long time ago, so I don't remember if it was especially, challenging. I remember it being really fun, and I remember it being a kind of new, approach to composition that I found at that time really satisfying and opened up some new possibilities. So that was really rewarding in that way. And I got to sample Utah Phillips, who's one of my heroes, which was really nice. He's another person I always wanted to bring some Utah Phillips into pieces that I wrote. So he has a little sample from a Democracy Now! Interview.
Okay.
Which you'll hear sort of 2/3 of the way through, I think.
A cameo, as it were.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's have a listen. This is "And the Sky Was Still There," performed by Nick Botinos.
The first thing I remember after getting through all the military initial processing at what's called the MEPS Center, that's the initial entry point, mine was in Charlotte, North Carolina, was a lot of standing around and a lot of yelling. We stood and stood and stood. We stood in lines because we stood in lines for no reason. We stood in line to eat. We stood in line to go places. We stood in line to get blood, to get shots, to get our clothes. We stood in line just for the sheer joy of standing in line. And in those lines, there was no talking. There was very little movement. We hadn't started basic training yet. We were still doing what is called reception before the actual training takes place. And I think that whole point of reception reception, besides all the initial processing things like getting all the appointments taken care of, was to learn how to stand in line. People were kicking me in the face, people were standing on my hands, people were crawling practically right over the top of me because we were all trying to get across this field. As you would if you were actually in combat and crawling, you would want to get across that wide open space as fast as you could. So that's what we were doing. I felt then the absolute impersonality of the military. I was only there as a weapon toter. I was not there for my mind, for my skills, for any of the fabulous things. For me, I was there only as a body with a gun. Living closeted in the military is unbelievably difficult. She was in the Navy, I was in the Army. You have to act as if nothing's wrong when people bash on gays all around you. You have to sort of go with it, or it will come down upon you too. We were in Arabic class together. We fell for each other really, really hard. If you tell, you get an honorable discharge. If they ask, and you tell, you get a dishonorable discharge. But all of a sudden, I was too tired to get out of my car. And I was sitting there looking across the flight line. There was a chain link fence in front of my car that I parked up against, and the sun was coming in through the front window. And I felt very warm and very cozy, and I could see the dust motes in my car in the sunlight, and it was beautiful. And I'm looking at that fence and the sky and the flight line and being exhausted. And it was like everything stopped. Time just stopped. The dust motes hung suspended. And I heard a voice that said to me, if you care about the state of your soul, if you care about anything at all, if you want to continue to be a good person, get out. You don't have much time. Get out. Get out now. And then the dust motes started up again. And the sky was still there. And the chain link fence. But I had changed. I was done. I had quit. In that moment, I understood that I needed to get out of the Army. go, but they said, you have to. And we're all told, if you have any reason why you want to go home, speak up now or hold on to it. And I told him. To transition back to civilian life, I decided to go hiking. My lover and I hit the Appalachian Trail. I spent about 3 months out in the woods and watched spring happen all around me, and I tried to figure out what I was going to do next.
Good job, Nick.
That's great.
David. Awesome music.
Thanks. It's interesting thinking about some of the stuff we've been talking about with storytelling and remembering the process of actually dealing with this block of audio, and in that middle section, sort of interjecting, she was in the army, I was in the, like the little clarifying moments that help to deliver the larger narrative. Kind of that process kind of came back, and what we had to remove, what we had to keep. There was an F-bomb we had to edit out so that could be radio friendly. I miss it every time I hear it.
Well, someday maybe I can record the original
edited version. Yeah.
Uncut director's
Yeah.
cut.
I liked how the narrative was so deadpan, and Nick seemed to be sort of channeling the undergirding emotions that we're only hearing by reading between the lines.
Yeah, it's in a way it describes such an ordinary moment but the ramifications of that ordinary moment are so huge in the life of this individual, this, I was gonna say character, but this real human being, and then placed in the context of controversial military policy and being in the military. I mean, the stakes are higher and higher, but it's just this one moment where your life changes, right? I mean, that everyone sort of has this one moment, sometimes not something that seems at the time all that significant, but everything is different after that. And I think that was one of the things that really drew me to this story, that it's just, after this, the dust motes froze, there was kind of no turning back, right? That was it. Life had changed for her.
Yeah.
Well, wherever people are watching from the comfort of your couch, as we now say, all these new phrases that we have, let's give a big hand, please, for Yasuko Ora, piano, and Nick Fotino's cello, please. Thank you guys so much for your artistry. I mean, just really incredible. And I don't know, putting those videos together, they look fantastic. They sound fantastic.
Thank you.
I can't tell you how much and I think I speak for all of us, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my pleasure.
And thanks for letting me hang out with the band.
Thank you.
So we're at the end of the program here. We're going to respect this 90-minute time limit that I arbitrarily made up right now. But let's just a couple quick plugs. John, am I insane, or do you have a novel coming out soon?
I have a new book coming out in a year. Two new books, actually, a novel called Subdivision and a story collection called Let Me Think. But if you're interested in the novel I was talking about earlier is my recently published one called Broken River, which you can get at the coronavirusly closed indie bookstore near you. Maybe they'll leave it out on the curb for you.
You can order it on their website and pick it up very safely, observing the proper rules and regulations. I read Broken River. It's an awesome book. So I recommend it. And Natalie and David will both be on the Bang on a Can Marathon this Sunday. Natalie, you want to tell us about that a little bit? Or
Sure. Yeah, I think it's actually serendipitous that David and I will be in the same hour. The whole marathon starts at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our music will be in the 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time hour. But it's first of all, the lineup is insane. Like
Crazy.
insane. So good. So much good music to be heard every minute of it. So I'm gonna be tuned in. And I think that we're also going to be filtering in some surprise interviews, conversations. Maybe I'm going to be in one, so stay tuned. But, you know, it's just an awesome way to hear a bunch of incredible music. So pour your cocktails, your mocktails, get your snacks, have a seat, put it on, throw it on, watch it, come back, listen. I've been doing a lot of that on Sundays, so I encourage it. And this is going to be so good. So hopefully everyone tunes in.
Great. And for those of you watching in Chicago, hopefully Yasuko and Nick can get their Chamber Music at Bethany series going in the fall. Right? Is that right? The fall?
Yeah. So in the fall, we had to postpone. We had concerts in March and also coming up in May that had to be postponed. I did want to mention, and this is actually beneficial if you liked what you heard tonight. So Bandcamp, right for today only until midnight, anything you buy through there, 100% goes to the artist. They're waiving their fee. So my album
Right.
that I came out with in 2017 that has David Tebow's piece on it, as well as the Norman came on that. Also, Natalie's album is also on Bandcamp.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Go buy that.
Go buy it. This is the time. Go do it. If you like what you heard.
Do it now.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. And sign up for the Relevant Tones podcast at your reputable podcast dealer, Apple, Spotify, whoever they are.
Remember the days when you had to go out in a parking lot behind the 7-Eleven to get podcasts?
I know.
Kids don't even know these days.
Natalie, John, David, I needed this. This was really good.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks,
this was so great. Thanks for having
really
us.
fun.
Do it again.
All right, guys, stay safe, stay sane, connected, all that good stuff. See you soon.
So long, everybody.
Take care.
Yeah.